a lot of that higher altitude review about a bank site, whether or not it's a good site, is really done by the LGU, and we rely on them for that. They know better than we do at that phase. But as you move more into the detail of the project, Bowser tends to take over with the engineering review and the veg plan review and accrediting and performance standards. We take on a much bigger role as those things move through. So as you get further and deeper into the process, our staff gets much more involved. All right, the review process. How did this come out in here? Not too bad. So this is the federal review process laid out in a time frame format. It's long. I think if you add up all the days on there, it's 265. Do you remember that number, John? You ever total them all up? I think it's 265.
Double it.
What's that?
Double it.
What that doesn't include is that in between the steps, you see it says sponsor prepares. So it doesn't include the time where a sponsor gets comments back and revises, updates, submits a new plan, or whatever phase you're at. So it's really 265 plus. So I wonder to this day about this process, if they ever thought about what they created with this, because the mitigation banking process exceeds a lot of the core permitting processes and timelines. I don't know if that was, I mean, it must have been the intent because they came up with it, but they really created a monster with this. It's a lot of work. I was at the Corps when the rule first came out, and people were scared to death of this process because they looked at how much work it was going to create in the agency for processing these. And when the rule came out and the feds were required to do this, there wasn't a pot of money that came with it to staff up to do this. It was just a requirement that was put on from that point forward to review banks. But you really get into it with Prospectus, which is phase 2, when you have 30 days to do a completeness determination, get a public notice out, a 30-day public notice, and then another 30 days to evaluate comments and get the initial eval letter back to the sponsor. Then an applicant would prepare the plan, and they would then submit the plan to the Corps, and then the Corps essentially has 90 days to turn that around and give you your status update letter. How many of you have had the Corps hit those targets, timeframes with your projects? How many of you have not? Nick doesn't want to raise his hand. I'm not taking names or pictures, Nick, you can be honest. I'll be honest, I've been at Bowser a year, and I know this process fairly well, and I know what the Corps review standards are, and we've submitted projects to the Corps, and they have not made the timelines on any of our projects. And not a criticism of any particular person over there, it's just this process is a beast, and they have to find time to move these things. Now, part of it, you could say the St. Paul District has a very centralized decision-making process, and only certain people can sign letters, and that may be part of the reason for it. But it's an onerous process, and it takes a lot of time. So what the graphic there are people who come in, who I talk to, or they call, and they're interested in doing banking, and they think they're going to have credits within 3 to 6 months, which is ridiculous, because you won't even get through the first phase of the review process and have credits. So there's a lot of people who back away from this when they see this. But we're trying to streamline some things and work with the Corps, and that's part of John Overland's job as that liaison, is to keep things moving and try to maintain those time frames. A lot of it, though, is going to depend on the Corps and how they manage things internally. So draft prospectus. Again, this is optional. I think I said earlier, it's an opportunity to get early agency input on a site's potential. So really, this is a high altitude look, and I'll go over in a minute the things that we're specifically looking at when we get these projects in. You cannot have an incomplete draft prospectus. You could submit a back of the envelope sketch, fill out the information on that form and submit it, and we'll review it. But really, the value of the feedback you get from us is directly related to the amount of work you put into the draft prospectus. So the more you can tell us about what you think the plan is, and the more you can tell us about the site, the better off the feedback you're going to get from us. And there's the first page of that revised, or updated draft prospectus form that we released earlier this year. So the things that we're looking for, and this is really taken out of, this is what we look at. These are the sources of information we go to. Drainage maps on websites. We look for proximity to airports because that is an issue for wetland banking projects. If they're within a certain distance from an airport, there's some federal MOUs about not allowing banks within certain distances from airports. So we screen for that right off the bat. We look for utility lines. And there's certain data sets out there we can go look for that information because utility lines or easements through bank sites are a problem. The feds often don't want those and they won't credit those areas. We're a little bit more lax with that on the state side, but it's still something where when you get to easement acquisition, and Lucy can speak to this, you're going to have to deal with those easements and what it means and work with those easement holders to get everything set up for the bank to be established. We look at historical photos, cropping history. So if you're using any of that information as a basis of getting credits, we're going to be looking at it and we're going to be providing some feedback on what we think you might get out of something like that. Wetland mapping, NWI stuff. The more recent one has more information, but we're certainly going to be looking to see are there wetlands mapped on the site because that's going to affect crediting. The public waters issue is something that I think we've worked past, but still we're looking to see if there's any of those state public waters, and of course we're looking at soils. If you're talking about restoration, we're probably going to want to see that there were hydric soils at the site. So beyond the rules and regulations, so some of the insights and things that are going on. Again, I already said, the level of review is commensurate with the quality of the submittal. So the feedback we give you is really dependent on how much you're going to give us to chew on, particularly the specifics of what you might be proposing. For example, we've had some projects come in draft prospectus and they say, I'm going to go in and I'm going to restore this area, I'm going to restore it to wetland. Well, that doesn't tell us a whole lot in terms of what kind of credit you might get out of it. There's no mention of what actions eligible for credit you may be trying to get credit under. So we kind of have to draw some conclusions, or at least our comments want to be directed towards, if you're going to go this way, we've looked at, if you're going to go at restoration based on, and get credit based on cropping history, we looked at some historical aerial photos, and it looks like it was only cropped 10 out of the last 20, so you may only get 50% credit for it. And that's the kind of information we feel is most valuable at this stage, because the bank sponsor is going to want to make a decision, usually involving economics. Is he going to get the money back out that he's putting into it? And a lot of that's going to come to credit. So we're going to want to know are there wetlands there, because that dictates credit. We're going to want to know what the cropping history was, if it looks like that's your credit source. Does that make sense? Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of proposals are using this step, and that's great. It's a little bit more work for us, but it does weed out some projects that really don't have much chance of going all the way and getting credit. Or people look at it and their break-even point isn't exactly where they thought it was, and they kind of abandon the project, or they modify the project. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the engineering reviews are not done by Bowser at this stage. So there's not going to be any formal engineering comments from Tom Lenz in the draft prospectus. I looked through some of our comment letters, and really almost all of them are going to address these issues. So we always suggest after draft prospectus that an applicant seek a title opinion to start looking at those potential issues that may come up with easement acquisition. It's never too early to start thinking about that. We strongly encourage them to get wetland delineations or determinations done, because again, that's going to affect crediting. I already mentioned crop history. If the easement boundary isn't set on some of the documents, if there's not a map showing that, we specifically ask them to prepare that for the next phase so that we can start looking at the easement and commenting on the easement boundary. There's certain things we look for with these easement boundaries. For instance, we generally don't want stormwater ponds within easement boundaries. So we will always comment that, you know what, get that stuff out of there. We really don't want to take that on. It creates conflicts with some of the prohibitions. We don't want to have to deal with it. We also have to keep easement boundaries out of road right-of-ways. You'd be surprised how many times we get easement boundaries that include a lot of things that we really don't want in there. So that's, we'd like to start having that discussion at prospectus. The other big thing is effect on adjacent lands. So that is one of our big review criteria, is that if you're going to be going in and restoring wetland, do you have the potential to stack water on somebody else's property? So that is a key thing we're looking at. That's going to come down to, do you have the topographic data to be able to assess whether or not you're going to be pushing water on somebody else's land. And we're particularly talking about surface water. So if you're putting in a structure, you're putting in a weir or something, we're going to want to see the topographic data and also potentially modeling that's going to show where are you putting water and it's going to go off your site. First thing our engineers do when we put a map in front of them is they're looking at those restored basins. And if you have a basin on your site that you're restoring and that basin goes off of the easement boundary, you're going to get a comment from us because you're going to be putting water on somebody else's property. So pay attention to that. Other information necessary to support crediting. Decimal figures, I put that as kind of a joke because Core will always comment on decimal figures in your documents. So pay attention. Did they put out a guidance document on that, or is it just a comment they did? I can't remember. I know we get it all the time. What do they want? The acres to a tenth and credits to 4 decimal places. Yes?
Oh, I was just thinking more specific, but you didn't.
What's that?
I was just wondering if you could be more specific, but you didn't.
I think I got it right. I'll have to check it, but I think that's right. All right, prospectus. Again, federally required, state optional. Involves a completeness determination by the Corps. Yes, Beth?
So for the draft prospectus, can you address a little more why you think the WACA process or the WACA review process is longer than the Corps recently?
Why the WACA one's taking longer?
Yeah.
Anyone have a thought? No. Because there is a timeline in the federal rule for getting comments out on a draft prospectus, and the Corps is actually working hard to make that. And on the state side, there isn't a time frame, so there's no 1599 clock on a draft prospectus. And we've often put those comments on the back burner if we have some other one that we have to get out. So generally, we're trailing the Fed process on draft prospectus, not by a whole lot, but with some of their newer PMs, they really are pushing draft prospectus out pretty quickly and turning things around. Has anybody seen that? Notice that? No? I have, because I have to try and get them comments and they're all over me to get them back. I think I have 15 days to comment on a draft prospectus. So they're actually moving those fairly quickly. Good question. Let's see, complete determination of the Corps, and then I already went over the public review process for the Corps, that 90-day period that they take for prospectus review. We talked about that last one already. There's the form, the updated form that I mentioned has been out. And the prospectus one is interesting because if you look at the requirements in the federal rule, actually I didn't bring it with me, prospectus and the form tracks it pretty well. But for a prospectus submittal, you really don't have to have all the information on like a full design or all the crediting or performance standards. It's really not required. But it's creeping into the prospectus form on here that we're asking for it. And I think that's a reflection of the kind of the 3-step review process right now under the state, is that the state really wants to be able to comment on those before somebody submits the full plan because of the 1599 and the absence of a 4th phase. So you're seeing now with prospectus, there's a lot of interest from the agency standpoint of getting as much information on those things as we can, because it's good for us to be able to see what direction you're going and comment on that before you go to the extent of preparing the full plan. And prospectus, according to the federal rule, doesn't really require a lot of that information, but I agree. I think it's a good idea to do that and get the agencies commenting on that, because when you start preparing full plans, it's quite an investment when you're doing that. And if you don't hit the target, and the agencies aren't necessarily agreeing with the direction you're going, you're going to be doing a lot of revisions to some fairly decent-sized documents. So it's kind of a good idea to do that. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you have a sense for what the level of drop-off is between folks who successfully get through prospectus but then don't make it through final or full plan review?
So the drop-off from completing a prospectus and then getting an approved plan, so what's the delta there? No, I really don't. My guess is that most folks who are doing the prospectus and get fairly decent comments back are going to go ahead and go through and do full plan. I know there's some that drop off, but there's some that drop off because they get some pretty harsh comments back. I mean, there's been some sites that have come through that have some real hard constraints with them, and the bank sponsor's trying to push it, and there's some tough things to work through with regard to easements, and they think they're gonna get 100% credit when the agencies come back and say, I think you're looking more at 50%, and that really changes the economics on things. So there's a bunch that kind of stall out for more discussion as full plans are being prepared. But I don't really have a solid number, but my guess is it's well over 75% of those that come out that don't have the big red flag comments probably go through and get approved. And I think that's part of the review process in Minnesota. It's pretty thorough. And there's a lot of folks involved, and there's a lot of comments. So generally, if you're working through, you're going to get a good idea after Prospectus whether or not you have a viable project. So I kind of mentioned a few things in here about specific issues that have come up. So agency staff are looking for crediting information, including justification for the credit being requested. Across the state and federal agencies, there's a level of frustration because you'll have on some of these credit actions that say up to 50%, the bank plans come in 50% credit. And we're looking for justification for why 50%. And it's not because we're trying to stick everybody, it's because we're trying to be consistent with how we're making decisions and using that scale. So you'll probably see comments back like that if you're just coming in and saying 50% when it says up to, because we're trying to find out where projects land on that scale. I think there's a lot of terminology about functional lift in comment letters. I'm not a big fan of that right now, because I think if you asked 50 regulators how you define and assess functional lift, you get 50 different answers. So that's one of the things we're working on as agency staff, is to try and define those scales and give bank proponents some idea of what we're looking for in terms of where you would land on those scales. I think I've already mentioned all these things here for the most part. Oops. So frequent agency comments on Prospectus. And I've seen this a lot too, finalizing baseline conditions. So really that baseline condition is going to define your crediting. And we comment pretty frequently on wetland delineations on bank projects, because we want to see those approved before you start getting into the full plan. So if we don't have some sort of verification, or you can't confirm for us that your wetland delineation line has been approved, we're going to keep asking for it, because if that line changes at some point after you submit a full plan, your plan's going to have to change. So we push that pretty hard. Surprisingly, it remains an issue for a lot of bank sponsors as they move through the process. That, well, we're going to submit that, or we're making some tweaks, or we're going to do a delineation this fall. It's like, I don't know how you can go through crediting without ironing out what your baseline condition is. It really does matter. Again, we start to get in more detail in the plan. We study that adjacent land use issue and how it may affect the site, and how the site may affect adjacent land uses, vegetation management, hydrology modeling I mentioned, actions eligible for credit, and crediting amounts. We have a lot of discussions about buffers, so adequate buffer widths and how you credit buffers, and portions of sites that don't have adequate buffers, and how we suggest, or the agency position is that if you don't have adequate buffers, maybe you get reduced credit for like a 50-foot width in a wetland where there's no buffer along a road or something like that. Anybody seen that comment? I know John has. Yeah, that's a pretty common one, and that's pretty consistent between the Corps and Bowser. So full plan. So this is when you get into the 1599 review kicks in. You get into that really detailed plan. So this is when we're going in-depth on the technical issues and in-depth in screening a lot of the easement issues, at least from a wetland section side. And then we're also looking hard at tying the crediting to credit release schedules, to performance measures, or performance standards, and then to monitoring. So we're looking hard to make sure all that stuff is consistent with rule, and then it all ties back. So for example, there were, and we've gotten much better at this, but there were banks that were approved. I'm trying to think of the most recent one where this came up. Let's just say 5 years ago, where it had hydrology performance standards. And the monitoring plan had no plan to capture the information that the sponsor was going to need to demonstrate that they met the standard to get a credit release. Does that make sense? So they may say, we're going to have hydrology within 12 inches of the surface for 14 consecutive days during the growing season, and we're going to monitor by hydrology by digging a soil pit at the beginning of the year and checking it every 10 days. Is that going to get you the data you need to assess the compliance with the standard? You guys are very not interested in this.
No.
The answer is no. I think I kind of mentioned this stuff. So you're focused on that technical engineering, suitability, the crediting, relationship between credit action, performance standards, monitoring, I mentioned that, and then again, the easement acquisition issues. This is an example, John Will Valley Bank, where just to show you that the comments aren't always critical of the plan that's been prepared. In this particular case, when we were reviewing it at Bowsville, we recognized that you had some restoration going on, and there were some ditches that were going to be plugged, but not necessarily backfilled the whole way. And in preparing the plan, Stantec, if I can use your company name, John, correctly went and split out the wetland plant community types like the agencies have asked for, particularly the Corps, within the ditch. When we looked at that from a review standpoint, we were like, really? We're going to split out these areas? Because what you end up with is when you get to a credit release table, when you start looking at some of these communities, the total acreage, shallow open water 0.476, 0.415, and then deep marsh 0.327. When you divide that up on a credit release table, look at these numbers. So your release would be 0.0476 credits. And our discussions internally was that's just way too much detail. We don't need to go there with this stuff. Those are like minefields in a bank ledger, that something's going to happen with all these tiny numbers that are going to throw it off. And so what our comment back to, as a reviewing agency, back to the IRT and to the LGU was, combine all those into one. Just pick one and do one credit type for that whole area. It's not worth splitting these out. And we've been doing that more often on bank projects where we see that, the excessive detail just isn't getting us anywhere in terms of the value of the product. So just an example of some of the comments that we're providing back. They're not always critical of the plan that's proposed. What we're trying to also look for is how can we make these things more efficient and make more sense in terms of the time that's invested from everyone's standpoint in review and approval of these, not only during the bank review process, but afterwards when we get to credit releases. Nick, yeah.
In regards to the use of those same credits, do you believe the same flexibility exists on the back end? When there's a need for a specific type of credit and now it's been lumped, do you think the agencies will split then?
I think for those ones that I picked out where you have shallow open water, deep marsh, and shallow marsh, I think it should work for all those.
Okay.
I'm more of a lumper than a splitter when it comes to these credit types. I think we've gone too far with breaking up credit types. And we're having some discussions with the Corps about what we can do to make the system a little bit more efficient in terms of dealing with the credit types. But yeah, I mean, I would put all those together and I would say, you know what, I don't know what the largest acreage was of those, but maybe you call it that. But that may not be fair to a bank sponsor because the Corps has come out and said, shallow open water is garbage. We don't think there's any value in that. We don't want to replace anything else with that. It's not worth it. It's like, well, your program recognizes it, so it has to have some value. That's another discussion, but I think exactly what you're saying is the way it should play out. Is that the agency should show some flexibility within kind when they're looking at things like that. Yeah.
So are you coordinating that discussion with the Corps? Because Wes and I, it's not more than a week ago that we were out at a site that we had the MBI done, and there's probably, most of it was shallow marsh and wet meadow, and there was 20 acres of shallow marsh or something around that. And then there was a little spot in the very middle that maybe less than an acre that was a maybe it could be a deep marsh, we couldn't tell yet because it's like, you know, it was an as-built review.
Yeah.
And the Corps is talking about redoing the whole MPI. So I guess what I'm asking is, and that's, you know, that can be a long process to redo an MPI and then get a credit release. So is there coordination occurring? I think that what you're saying makes sense, but I'm concerned that that won't be implemented by the Corps on the back end. We'll be stuck, our applicant will be stuck with not getting a credit release because he has to go through an MPI.
It's being coordinated at a number of levels. So from a programmatic standpoint, we've brought the issue to the Corps' attention and asked them to work with us on addressing it, because we want to address it through rulemaking. And we're starting to ramp up the rulemaking process. And so we want that to be part of it. We don't want to act unilaterally on it because it's going to really cause the programs to diverge. For years, we've been trying to get them together. So at the program level, yes, it's being discussed. On a project-by-project basis, yeah, because you see through the comments where we're trying to address that as well. The whole issue with the MBI, personally, I think the Corps has a flexibility within the MBI to make a change like that, because it's really not a change in the plan. It's really not a change in the acreage. It's just a recognition of how they're going to classify credits on there. I don't think it's that big of a deal. And if they were to run it through the IRT review process, which they'd be required to do, I don't even think anybody would comment on it. It'd just be a big bureaucratic process with all these timeframes to go in and change it. I mean, because essentially it's no change in the acreage of the bank plan, right?
Correct.
It's a change in how you're classifying areas of the site in terms of credit type. So I don't know why that would require new MBI, but that's their call. I'm not authorized to speak on their behalf. We have to delete that from the audience or video, whatever it is. All right. So I'm going to go real quick through what I've been talking for about an hour. It's warm in here, and I think the interest level is starting to fade a little bit. So, but I want to go through easement acquisition one because this is an important, critical part of getting your bank established, and I think it's probably the least understood of the parts of the process. So this is post-bank plan approval. This has to be done if you're going to get credits. Now luckily we have Lucy here. Lucy, please stand up and wave to the crowd. She is our easement specialist at Bowser, who's processing all the wetland bank easements. So this is a great step forward for our review and for our process, because we now have somebody that is working on this stuff and has dedicated time, and we're putting resources towards supporting her doing this work, and she's doing a great job so far. Things are moving much faster. Like John said when I talked to him before I started, somebody called me about an easement, you know. And that's no knock on the people from our agency who are doing it before. They really didn't have a whole lot of time dedicated to do it. So we were making do with an arrangement that is different from what we have now, where we have a person working on this stuff. So we're already making process improvements. We're already working on a bunch of things. So I'm going to go through this real quick. And Lucy, if there are things I'm not articulating correctly, you need to step up and put me in my place. But some general stuff. Easement acquisition is typically initiated after the bank plan approval. Not in every case. There's been some in the past where this has been done, but the coordination internally now is they're typically not starting on them until we give them the green light. So there's some where we're real close to bank approval and they may submit the paperwork and I say, yeah, go ahead, that one's going to go through, shouldn't be a big deal. There are some where people submit the paperwork way ahead of time, and I think we said, nah, I think we want to hold off on that one. You know, things may change on this, and it's probably not a good idea to get started on it. Easement acquisition does not have to be completed prior to construction. There's plenty of banks that are constructed before easement acquisition is done. However, bank sponsors do that at their own risk. So if you're going to invest in doing the construction, you should be aware that if something comes up during the easement acquisition process that the state decides we don't want to take that easement, we're not going to take it. If you've gone ahead and constructed a site that will not be a bank other than Minnesota Wetland Bank. So there's some risk there. If you've gone through the bank review process and you've got that title opinion and you've kind of looked at things and you feel fairly comfortable with it, more power to you. But I'm risk adverse, so I would be scared to go ahead and do much of this without knowing a little bit more about easement acquisition before I start. I already mentioned the process. Lucy is our point of contact. She's not in the wetland section, she's in the easement section, so it's outside of the wetland section. So our wetland specialists in the field, while they may have a general understanding of the easement acquisition process, they are not the point of contact for easement acquisition. They will probably refer you to the website or to Lucy, but they are not the ones to really provide in-depth information, or they're not responsible for submitting any of the documentation to Lucy, to our easement section. We've had a couple banks that have been delayed significantly in easement acquisition because the bank sponsor thought it was the LGU or SWCD's job to submit their paperwork. And then 6 to 12 months later, they asked for status, and we report back, we never received anything. And it's because they thought it was somebody else's job. The bank sponsor's job to submit the paperwork. And that process is laid out on our webpage. I think on my next slide has it in here. So we're in the process of revising this. The information on the website will probably be updated in a day or so. We need to talk because I found something on there, particularly with number 1. So there is a fee now with easement acquisition. Part of it's paid up front, the remainder is paid at the back end. And that's a reflection of if you pay up front in the easement acquisition process, we identify something that's problematic, we didn't want to charge you the whole fee if we don't end up acquiring the easement. So we kind of back-ended it in case you pull out and you didn't want to do it. Number 1 needs to also say that they need to submit the paperwork, the forms that are on the website. It just says applicant submits the easement acquisition fee to Bowser. We got to make sure we recognize that the forms that are required on there. You agree with that?
I was told not to look at any forms until we have the payment.
Really? What number did they submit the form on here? I'm sorry, we're having a dialogue. Do that next. Anyway, I'm not going to go through it step by step, but it's fairly well laid out there about how things go. And the important thing to remember is easement acquisition is not just simply you submit some paperwork and you wait for Bowser to get it done. You have to have a title agent, and there's a back and forth with that person, and that person works for you, and they often dictate a lot of the timelines, am I right? So when people come to us, where's the easement acquisition? It's been taking forever. It's like Lucy and her predecessor, Christy, have pretty good notes about where things are at in the process, and they do the reviews and turn things around and kick it back to a title agent or to a survey, somebody doing the survey. Oftentimes, we're waiting for them to get back to us. So, I mean, granted, they got their stuff to do and they have priorities, but just understand, this isn't you drop it in the mailbox and in a certain amount of time, Bowser gets back to you. There's a back and forth associated with the easement acquisition. There's quite a bit of it. So that lays out the process. So here's some of the important things to keep in mind. And this comes right out of some of the document that Lucy provided me. Applicants may wish to obtain a title opinion early in the process, we've talked about that, to identify issues prior to survey work and more extensive title work. So that's that thing, you'll see comments in the review process right around prospectus that we would suggest you go get that done to start looking at these potential issues. The second one there, applicants. What's that?
Can I add something to that?
Absolutely.
So when you do ask for a title opinion, the title agent needs to look for everything on the property. A lot of them maybe haven't worked on a title commitment for something like a wetland bank, and so they won't know to look for things like severed mineral